Well, it's my great privilege to be here to, of course, receive the Tyler Award and to deliver this talk. The award was, in its inaugural year, awarded to George Evelyn Hutchinson, who was a great inspiration for me as an undergraduate. And then when I joined Harvard as a graduate student, I had an opportunity to be with him. My guru at Harvard, Ed Wilson, also received this prize. And there is a long list of very distinguished people. So it's wonderful to be here and to be in that company and to share my experiences, which I guess have been responsible for my getting this very prestigious award. Thank you very much for having me here to deliver this talk. We are here concerned with issues relating to environment, and as a student of evolutionary biology, one may ask, what is it that makes our species so dominant a member of the biosphere, and of course, which is why we are thinking of this whole range of issues relating to the environment. And the answer that students of human evolution give is that humans are so dominant because they have fashioned a cognitive niche, that with our powerful language, we are able to develop knowledge, and in a sense, our distinction is, as a species, is that we are informivores, that for us, information is an important resource. And information is a special resource because you can share information without depleting it. And that has given our species a tremendous advantage over rest of the organisms, having in some sense developed this very unique resource which enables us to deal in real time with a whole range of issues, whereas all other species by and large have to deal with these kinds of issues of how to deal with other organisms, how to deal with other environmental problems that they face in evolutionary type. But we can deploy our knowledge and deal with them in real time, which, as I said, is our great strength. We have a number of unique features. Amongst them is cooperation amongst non-kin. Social animals, by and large, are members of societies which are kin-based, whereas here we are. I mean, I guess I certainly am not related by blood to anybody here, but we are all part of a cooperative group. We are interested in exchanging information, working with each other, and it is this ability of human species to be part of large groups which are not tied together by blood relationships that have again given us an important strength. Science and technology is, of course, one such cooperative endeavor, and it is a remarkable endeavor because humans are able to, in the course of developing the great store of information that they have, of mixing very effectively truth and falsehood. And in a sense, it is easier to tell lies than to tell the truth, because truth has to be very specific. Lies can be all over. But of course, there is another kind of problem, that if to repeat the same lie twice is a little more difficult. Repeat the same truth twice is much easier. However, because it is so much easier in a sense to come up with a lie than come up with a true statement, we have developed ways of mixing up the two. Now, part of the environmental issues, I think, also lie in the fact that we are able to convince ourselves of many falsehoods, and people are able to, with great authority and sincerity often, make statements which are palpably false. And behind that, and behind such statements lies a whole range of environmental issues. For instance, I think a large number of friends of mine are quite convinced that human technological ingenuity will always overcome any possible environmental problem. Now people are getting a little less sure of that, but when I was a graduate student in the 60s, there was a very broad conviction, and these are kinds of statements that people repeated without really carefully examining their validity. Now science, I think, is a particularly effective way of overcoming this, because as J.D. Bernal, a very distinguished molecular biologist, I guess one of the founders really of molecular biology and of this whole discipline of sociology of science, has said science is an organized enterprise of skepticism. So since humans deal with such a difficult mixture of truth and falsehood, being skeptical, examining everything very carefully is critical to success. And science succeeds primarily because of this insistence that everybody must be skeptical of anything that is around, that everybody has the right to examine what is being asserted, that everybody must have some standard against which it will be tested, and then add on to that information. So science has grown so remarkably because of this insistence on examining everything very carefully. And when we talk of this, then science is also a system which rejects all authority other than that of empirical facts. And by rejecting all authority, I believe science has become also a system which is the most democratic and most liberating of the systems of knowledge. Now, India has a long tradition of skepticism, though unfortunately that skepticism was set aside over most of Indian history. Gautam Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, in fact insisted that he should not be accepted as an authority. Well, he was not only not divine in any way, but he should not be accepted as an authority, that whatever he stated must be examined against people's experience and common sense, and then only accepted. Science, of course, has gone on to add other points. Buddha does not talk about empirical observations being a very important basis for deciding on what is correct or not. I guess his common sense, in a sense, reflected that. Science has gone on to add very carefully empirical observations to this. So science is a remarkable, very powerful system, and it has been used to do many things, to help humanity, to manipulate other people, as well as hurt other people. And one of the major motivations behind development of science and technology throughout human history has been to help warfare. And even today you can see that military applications are a major driving force behind science. And one of the reasons why India and perhaps the parts of the world which were away from the European center where in the Middle Ages the scientific method evolved, including countries like China and Arabic countries which had earlier been leaders in knowledge, and India fell behind, was this methodology of science of carefully looking at all empirical facts, using them to understand how the world works and then deploying them to develop technologies. That was evolved in Europe. But that gave Europe a tremendous advantage over all other societies. This is very interestingly illustrated by one historical series of historical wars between British and the Indian rulers. Tipu, who was in South India, one of the major rulers in the 18th century, he initially defeated British roundly in the first war in 1782, because he had brought from China rockets which the British were completely unaware of, and Tipu had picked up from the Chinese the technology of using these rockets very effectively, and the British army was routed. But when running away, the British army collected a whole lot of unexploded rockets, and other information about how the rockets were used. They went back to British research and development labs associated with the Woolwich Arsenal in Great Britain, and in the next few years, they developed their own rockets and they understood fully how to deal with rockets. And Tipu had no such notion. The Indian rulers had no notion of scientific methodology of developing science-based technologies. So in the next war, I guess 1792 or whatever it was, the British defeated Tipu and went on to conquer Tipu and the rest of the Indian rulers. So the importance of science-based technologies for warfare has been a very major influence on the earth, and including on the environment. I must say that amongst the most influential happenings that I experienced when I was a graduate student at Harvard was the Vietnam War. And amongst the discussions that were going on was the destruction of the rich tropical forest of Vietnam by Agent Orange and the whole biological warfare machinery which was being employed in that war. Anyway, so the question is whether, and of course, as I said, since between 65 and 69 when I studied at Harvard, this was really a very live debate. I was prompted to think more and more about science, its function, and what positive function it can and should play in human society. And this statement by Albert Einstein, which he wrote very soon after the atom bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that humanity must abandon competition and secure cooperation if we are to survive and go ahead. As I said, obviously had been an important influence and was part of that debate in which I was involved. And I therefore began to think of how I may adopt what I was learning. I was fascinated by ecology, and my early work was all basic understanding how evolution and forces of natural selection have shaped ecological parameters. It was most enjoyable work, but the question was, what is the way one can apply this understanding of ecology? And as I mentioned, in the Indian culture, one of the important thought streams of thought is the Buddhist thought. And here is a very interesting statement by one of the leading exponents of Buddhism today, Dalai Lama, that since, as I said, he says, I deeply believe that basically human beings are of a gentle nature, so I think the human attitudes towards our environment should be gentle. And Interestingly enough, the environmental debate that I also became involved in as a graduate student had two very different kind of strains. There was, and there continues to be, a strain of so authoritarian environmentalism, which indeed thinks that humans are basically evil and all problems arise from these evil human tendencies, and what we need to do is somehow to curb these tendencies, not to believe that humans can actually act in ways that they can behave prudently and take care of the environment. The other streams of thought, as I said, which I have been much more influenced by, is that you cannot think of taking care of environment without taking care of human concerns, of human needs. And a very interesting paper also appeared as I was a graduate student by Laureate. He asked, are there any prudent animals? Are there any examples in the animal world of a species which acts prudently, which uses its resources, its resource base in a way to maintain its health on the long-term basis? And he, after looking at a whole lot of evidence, he said, no, the only known animal, prudent animal, is human beings. That we are capable of thinking of what is our long-term possibilities and act prudently, though most of the time we may not do so. I became very interested, amongst other things, in the whole traditional practices, historical practices of taking care of environment. And I, in fact, returned to India and began to see that the Indian society displayed a whole series of practices of taking care of nature. We still have in India substantial patches of sacred forests. We still have, right in the middle of Indian city, monkeys roam around who are protected because people think they are sacred creatures, we should not harm them. So you have had a series of practices of conservation at all stages of human technological progress. One way in which conservation has been talked about is that there were perhaps practices like sacred forests, but these were superstitions, these were accidental, they could not have had any genuine intent at conservation, and that genuine rational conservation only began after scientific knowledge came into being, after the Middle Ages, following, as I said, the European scientific enlightenment. Jared Diamond, who is one of my distinguished predecessors, and I had long interaction with him. One of my most enjoyable periods in life was a 2-week field trip with Jared in the mountains of Arizona. Anyway, Jared thinks that yes, there are evidences of conservation, but they are just accidental. They are superstitions. They could not have been rational human behavior. And I disagree, and let me say why I disagree. Yes, there are changes in the way conservation practices have been implemented. In the when I say size of human aggregations, I am talking about small-scale societies, primarily hunter-gatherer, shifting cultivator societies, agricultural societies, and then going on to modern industrial societies where the aggregations have changed in size, and the way the conservation has been implemented has changed. But does it mean that only recently have we had any rational basis for conservation? As I say, I do not believe that is so, that there has been a rational basis all along. I now want to spend a little time on my own interest and how I am visualizing how science may be employed towards serving symbiotic relationships, promoting symbiotic relationships between different social groups in India and globally. This parallel to the west coast of India runs a hill chain called the Western Ghats. I was born and brought up amongst these hills. They are a wonderful natural setting. One of India's most inspiring poets, Kalidasa, I am not quite sure how has visualized it, but in describing the geography of India, says these hills are like a beautiful maiden. You can actually see the way that he says that the head of this maiden lies at the southern end of India. The two mountains of South India are her two breasts. Goa, where I work, is her waist, and these are her feet. Anyway, and the poem describes the beauties of the Western Ghats. From a young age, I was enchanted and involved, and I became interested in a whole range of issues. This is, of course, the Indian rhinoceros. In front of biological labs at Harvard, there are two magnificent statues of these rhinos. And amongst other interests, amongst trying to understand ecology, I also became very interested in methodology of science, history, philosophy of science. Harvard had a very influential school of science history. I think Thomas Kuhn, who did his work on structure of scientific revolutions, and many other distinguished historians of science had been at Harvard. And what I began to look at after starting my work in India, primarily on the ecology of Western Ghats, was how ecology was being used, and being used in the terms of, importantly, natural resource management. And it became, I quickly saw that ecology was in fact being used not to promote better management of biological resources, but as a tool of domination. That in the mid-19th century, after the takeover by the British of India, people of course were tremendously impressed by the value of science, that the thinkers, Indian thinkers of that period, immediately following the British conquest of India, keep talking about the superiority of British lying in their scientific understanding, and that it was very important for Indians now to pick up, to understand what all this science and science-based technologies were. So science-based technologies had a tremendous prestige. Obviously, as I was talking about these rockets and so on, it had been proved again and again that this was really the key to the superiority of, certainly the military superiority at least of the British. But they used this prestige to claim that Indian systems, including those of biological resource management, had no merit, that it is only application of science, so-called science, to management of India's biological resources, which would make sure that India's biological resources are properly, sustainably managed, and introduce so-called scientific systems of forest management, water management, a whole range of natural resource management issues. But if you will see, this was a claim which was not genuinely valid, because one must think really of, in a sense, two streams of science and what is possible in these two streams. The simpler systems, many of the physical chemical systems, They can be dealt with by the experimental method of science, because replication is possible. And because replication is possible, claims which are made about how the system behave can be verified, and you can therefore question, take knowledge forward. In the case of complex systems, this is not possible, and these successes of experimental form of science with simpler systems was used to control, manipulate the physical world, chemical world effectively, which was, as I said, part of basis of also the whole application of war to warfare and to industrial modes of production and so on. But complex systems are different. As Greek philosopher Heraclitus has said, you cannot put your foot in the same stream twice. The stream is flowing and changing constantly, and therefore you cannot apply these kind of experimental methodology of carefully controlled replicated observations, replicated experiments in the context of complex systems. Or Stephen Jay Gould, who in fact incidentally had an office next to mine at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, has written extensively about historical sciences and how they are different from simpler sciences of simpler system, which can be based, which can grow through, where knowledge can grow through experimental method. When you are talking about natural resource management, we are dealing with complex systems which are basically historical. Their understanding requires an understanding of their history. And you cannot apply this methodology which is applied to the simpler systems to these. Therefore, when you start talking of forest management, you need the kind of data which is not readily available to people at large. And the British, as part of their forest management, water management, in general natural resource management, began to assert a lot of claims which could not be readily validated, could not be readily assessed. And the state set up a whole apparatus of collecting data about forest ecosystems, about issues like wildlife, and then dictating how these should be managed. So one of my interests was to understand these systems, and it is very clear. I do not want to go into details, but it becomes very clear that when you look at the whole system, so-called scientific forest management of forests for sustainable use on basis of scientific understanding is what British claimed, but in fact there was very poor empirical basis for such claims, nor did the way that the system accept a critical component of science, that it should be open to examination by everybody. Amongst other experiences I had was a debate which was organized by Finance Minister of West Bengal, is one of our progressive states of India at that time, on forest management. And I tried to point out that the forest working plans, they should be treated as scientific hypotheses, that you say the forest has certain composition, certain dynamics, you are going to intervene in certain ways in those forests, and the consequences would be such and such. That is what a forest working plan says. So you must examine whether the predicted consequences actually materialize, and this should be done openly. But in the tradition which was laid down by the British foresters also earlier, the head of West Bengal's forest department said, no, no, these are technical documents. Nobody but a trained forester can understand them. They should not be allowed to be looked at by anybody else, including Madhav Gadgil, who may claim to have some ecological understanding, but it is only a trained forester who understands what is going on. Then the forest working plans amongst other things, were not even accessible at that time in India. There was no right to information in 1980s. It came only in 2005. But I had access to the libraries of the Forest Research Institute. It turned out that they did not even have a full set of India's forest working plans. You could not assess what was going on sitting in India. Finally, I managed at the Oxford Forestry Institute, had a full set, interestingly enough, and where I could examine them. Anyway, and the working plans were full of bogus data. Again, I don't want to go into details. Deliberately falsified data to be able to give license to paper mills, because the paper mills were going to make enormous profits, because amongst other things, the paper industry was being given forest resources at throwaway prices. Bamboo was an important raw material for paper industry. When the basket weavers, the rural users, were buying bamboo at 1,500 rupees a ton, the mill was being given bamboo at 1.5 rupee a ton, and it was just a notional price. They were being given these resources free, so paper mills were very happy to industrialists to set up paper mills, run out of bamboo resources rapidly, while the forest department was claiming they were being sustainably used. There were obviously all sorts of these issues. The other interest I had was wildlife conservation, management, the decision on where to set up protected areas. And I looked at the way the protected areas were selected. It again seemed that they were completely arbitrary, depending on whims and fancies of various influential people. Areas were declared as protected areas. At that time, UNESCO had come up with this idea of Biosphere Reserves, and I became very interested, and Government of India asked me to rationally look for what would be the best place to set up a Biosphere Reserve in the Western Ghats. And I did an exercise, I would imagine. It was the first such exercise of using some rational criteria to decide on limits of protected areas, and a Biosphere Reserve was set up in the Nilagiris, which are parts of the Western Ghats. I was also asked, after it was in operation for 10 years, to look at how the Biosphere Reserve management had worked, how it had performed. Now, one of the interesting, one of the important biodiversity resources of Nilgiris are the fishes of these rapid hill streams. There are a whole lot of fishes which are restricted to these hill streams of Nilgiris. So, one of the questions that I had to look at was, how has the protection to Biosphere Reserve helped in the conservation of these hill stream fishes? So, I went to Jairam, who is a good friend of mine, who was India's leading freshwater fish expert, and asked him, how do I set about it? Firstly, to look at all the literature on freshwater fishes of Nilgiris and of these hill streams, and how do I progress? He said, there is hardly any literature. What has happened since the establishment of the Biosphere Reserve, if you want to understand, the best thing is to do is to go and meet Kaliyappan. Kaliyappan is a fisherman. He was illiterate, nice chap, but he had been fishing these hill streams for decades, and he said, all Jairam knows, Kaliyappan knows, and more about the particular ecosystem, those of Nilgiri hill streams. Kaliyappan uses only the local Tamil names for fishes. Other than that, he doesn't know the zoological names, but he is the person you should go and you should talk to. So, I did that. I spent some days in this Moyar Gorge, was where he was primarily working, had been fishing in, and we fished, and I camped with him on the banks of Moyar at night, and we ate fish and we talked, and put together a whole understanding of how the Biosphere Reserve management had been affecting the streams, and the fishes. And this document I took to Jairam and showed him, and he said, yes, I mean, this makes complete sense. There is no other source of understanding that you could have tapped. So I became very interested in a confluence of this kind of knowledge with modern scientific knowledge. Often people talk of it as traditional knowledge, which I fully disagree with this terminology. I think much better terminology is experiential knowledge, practical ecological knowledge. What Kaliyappa knew was not just tradition. He knew from his experience, and he knew changes that had been taking place over years, which was not part of tradition, which was modern changes. So it is this practical ecological knowledge which is of great relevance. There was also raging in ecology at that time a debate which was called Schloss Debate, whether you should select few large reserves or a number of small reserves. And again, Jared Diamond has written a lot about it. He has written a very interesting papers on New Guinea, Papua New Guinea's nature reserve system for Papua New Guinea, where he develops these ideas of why it is important to have few large reserves. And others were saying that no, several small reserves are equally relevant. But in all this Schloss debate in ecological literature, there was no reference to human concerns with biodiversity. A parallel debate was going on in philosophical debate. Brian Norton wrote this interesting book, Why Preserve Diversity, and others were interested, and they were saying the only reason that you can convincingly say biodiversity should be preserved is because of its transformative value. That humans, when they are exposed to biodiversity, they are better off, they become better human beings than those who are not exposed to this biodiversity. Now, if that is the reason, then the Schloss debate should have been also thinking of how one large reserve or several small reserves, how would they relate to human communities. If humans are to experience this biodiversity and become, so to say, better human beings, and if that is the rationale for conserving nature, then you must make this experience readily available to people. And this became, this was a point at which I became very interested in these sacred forests. Western Ghats had a whole series of such sacred forests which had been protected because of local religious beliefs, and in many places, as in this particular hill range, the rest of the hills had been completely deforested, but about 12 hectares of original evergreen forest was still preserved as a sacred forest. And there was a whole lot of network of such sacred forests, all quite small in size, but widespread, so that people had access, local communities had ready access to these. So clearly this was a traditional system where you preserved nature in ways that people would have ready access to primeval nature. These sacred groves, many of them, not even fruit of commercial importance was moved out of that. Everything was completely inviolate. When I began these studies, I got a letter from a village community in other parts of Western Ghats saying that we understand you are interested in sacred groves, please come and help us. The forest department has marked our sacred grove for felling, and we don't want it to be felled. And when I went and talked to the head of Maharashtra's forest department, this is in 1971, he said, well, you are a student of a good friend of mine, so I will agree not to cut this forest, but you are crazy. What are these sacred groves? They are just, in his words, stands of over mature timber. that there was no other value that he could attribute. So I began to examine a little more carefully what are the prescriptions that in Schloss Debate or in all these, those who are interested in nature conservation are talking about. They are nothing but some rules of thumb. We are dealing with these complex systems where we do not have universal laws valid over large domains which physics and chemistry can offer. There are some simple rules of thumb, and these are basically derived from historical observations. The same Slobodkin, who wrote this very interesting paper on are there any prudent animals, has also written a paper saying that ecologists have nothing to go by other than historical evidence. That looking at the history of an ecosystem, you can come up with prescriptions which would be relevant. And of course, people had been doing that. So I began to think of what might have been the rational way in which people might have selected these sacred grounds as areas to be protected. As I said, there are two perspectives. One is that before modern scientific conservation practices came into place, there was only superstition, there was no rationale, there may have been accidental conservation, but it had no meaning. Whereas I believe that that cannot be so, especially in the case of these complex systems, that there would have been rationale behind these rules of thumbs, and prescriptions must have evolved which were of value, which led to what was of value to the society. So I did some modeling. We looked at what might be the simplest decision rule that a society will use to decide on whether to increase the intensity of harvesting a resource or decrease it. The simplest would be that when you increase the effort, if the harvest goes up, then you increase the effort further, because increasing the effort is leading to better harvest. But if the harvest goes down when you increase the effort, then what you do is to decrease the effort. If the effort goes down and harvest goes up, then you decrease the effort further. If when the effort goes down, harvest also goes down, then you once again start increasing the effort. This seemed the simplest decision rule for when you are doing harvesting through basically trial and error, which all societies had been doing and in fact do even today. So I developed a model of what will happen to the resource when you follow such a decision rule, and the answer is very clear. It will always lead to complete exploitation and decimation of the resource, such a rule. So what might be the way in which systems like these sacred forests would have been evolved? The alternative, little more complex rule that I suggested and we tried to model was that whenever you step up effort, then you also step up your protection. That when you are going to harvest more intensively, you do not harvest the entire resource with that same higher intensity, but in fact you increase the size of the refugium, the area where the resource would be protected. Now, if you apply such a rule that every time you increase harvesting effort, you increase the size of the refugium which is protected, and if you decrease the harvesting efforts, you may decrease the area to be protected. Then you can show, the model shows that yes, you can indeed end up with a sustainable level of harvest. The resource will not be wiped out. Indeed, it will be maintained somewhere near what one may call an optimal sustainable level, along with areas which are fully protected. And in ecology, there had been these very interesting experiments by this Russian Gauss, which had also shown that populations will always be wiped out unless you provide them a refugium. So providing refugia, and indeed increasing the size of refugia when you increase your effort of intensity of harvesting resource, is the rationale. And I think some such thing must have been arrived at in the trial and error system in the traditional societies, because sacred groves have been a common feature of whole range of at least African and Eurasian societies. In the Greek times, there are descriptions saying that the sacred groves of Diana of Greece were so numerous that Greek landscape looked like a panther's skin, full of spots of refugia. So I believe there must have been this kind of a rationale, that you cannot say that there is a discontinuity in the conservation practices. There were earlier superstitious, foolish practices perhaps, and now we have scientific wise practices. This is a completely improper way to view them, that there has been a continuity, and our understanding of how to conserve has also not progressed the same way that our understanding of physical, chemical systems has progressed, and you should build on these rationale. This was also the time we had the Rio Earth Summit, and the Convention on Biological Diversity asks that all countries should make attempts at conservation, and while making those attempts, honor community level practices, community level knowledge. And I became very interested. India, as a follow-up of this convention, decided to develop a Biological Diversity Act. I was a member of the Government of India committee to formulate this act, and actually Dr. Swaminathan, an earlier Tyler awardee, was the chairman of that committee, and we came up with ways of provided a framework where local communities can be meaningfully involved and have positive incentives for conservation through a series of institutions. One of the components of the implementation of this act would be to develop a system of documentation of biodiversity based on a tool which has been called People's Biodiversity Register. This is a part of the formal Biodiversity Act, which would involve the local communities, local educational institutions, and develop this. One of the nicest such registers has been developed in a village in Maharashtra, and one of the most pristine rivers of Maharashtra today, unfortunately most are polluted, is this Kathadi river, and this is the team with whom we worked. I was also very much involved in other aspect of environmental education. The government had decided roughly the same time as the Rio Earth Summit that there should be environmental education should become part of all educational curricula in Indian schools and colleges. And I was chairing a committee on what kind of information and how to organize it. What we suggested was that there must be a process of developing a country-wide transparent participatory system which will generate information on environmental issues. This will involve both the educational institutions and the practical ecological knowledge. And in a sense, actually we now talk about citizen science, and there are, in Australia there is this Victoria State has a Water Watch program which really has taken this kind of approach further. In India we had formulated this, and to an extent this has been implemented, but certainly not as much as one had hoped to. That through that we will have public assessments of what is happening in the domain of the environment, and a participatory process of deciding on how to take care of environment. The last aspect of my recent work I want to talk about is an act which is called the Forest Rights Act, that in 2006 the Indian Parliament passed an act whose preamble says that there was historical injustice when the British took over all community managed forests by denigrating also the local community based systems of management which had value, and now we should try to re-establish some of these systems. So when our new Prime Minister, who was overwhelmingly with an overwhelming majority elected last year, about a year ago, in his very first speech talked about his intention to make development a people's movement. I was very happy. Unfortunately, it hasn't quite worked out, because I think the community management of forests under this act has been a very important opportunity to make development a people's movement. Lot of people express fears that these local communities, especially relatively uneducated, economically weak tribal communities, would not be able to manage community forests. They will simply destroy them. But the experience on the ground shows quite different. What has happened is quite different. One village I want to talk about, it's a village called Pasgaon, and they have been given 1,000 hectares for community management. Very interestingly, on their own, they have set up, I will come to that in a minute, some systems of better forest management, but also of giving strict protection. They did not have in that 1,000 hectares any sacred forest earlier. They decided that now that it is under their management, they will actually protect the crest of the hills from which the local streams arose as a sacred forest. And they have, this is the outline on the satellite image. The sacred forest is now under good protection, but more interestingly, or not necessarily more interestingly, but also very interestingly, they have made other decisions. Now, how they arrived at these whole forest management rules was very interesting experience. It is a small village. It has 100 households. So the village assembly got together and said that now that we have these 1,000 hectares for our own management, we must formulate proper rules for its management. Every house family has the responsibility of suggesting 5 rules. Doesn't matter. It is your obligation. You must suggest 5 rules. So they had a basket of 500 rules suggested by 100 families. There were a lot of duplications. They sat down, sorted out. There were 160 distinct rules. The whole village assembly sat down for 2 days, full days, and they formulated a set of about 32 rules which are now governing this community forest. One of that has identified that strict nature reserve to be kept as a sacred grove. Interestingly, they started debating how to deal with one particular resource which was getting them the highest level of income earlier. There is this species Diospyros xylon, locally called tendu. Now the leaves are used for rolling the Indian cherotes or bidis. These are small tiny cigarette like things, and there is large demand for that. Earlier, before the community control, forest department used to auction the rights for collecting these leaves, and private traders used to bid in the auction, get the rights. They were paying the villagers only daily relatively low wages to collect the leaves. But nevertheless, for these people, it was their largest cash income of the year. Now they started thinking of how now they should deal with this, because they realized that in the earlier system where there was no control, this was what was going on. It can grow into a very good middle-sized tree. They were keeping it lopped because it's easier to collect leaves when they are converted into shrubs. They were setting fires. They are saying that we have been destroying the forest and we must stop destroying it. They also had a very rational understanding of what will happen because the fruit of this Diospyros melanoxylon, it is a very tasty fleshy fruit. It has very good market value, but when you are maintaining the plant for collecting leaves, it hardly bears any fruit. They said, look, we will for next 2 years or so forego all income from collecting leaves. Let us see what will happen. Forest will improve. This Diospyros is only one of the species. It's a species-rich forest, mostly terminalias and so on. One of the species, forest will improve and you will get better yield. And this year they are telling me that the fruit yield has increased so much that selling the fruit on the market, they are probably going to get more money than they were getting out of plucking leaves. So you have a very rational way in which they are developing these systems. As a scientist, I am very happy because there is an insistence, in a way rightful insistence, that these village communities must prepare and present a document the forest working scheme. And the villagers, of course, are on their own not educated enough or not capable enough to prepare such a document. So, one of my most interesting experiences these days is to actually work with them, do forest resource assessment, try to get an understanding of dynamics of this forest and develop these schemes. But obviously, as I said, these rules and so on, they have developed based on their own historical understanding. So, as I said, perhaps I have been able to do something to deploy science in the service of mutualism. That I have been able to, well, firstly, critically examine, evaluate the systems of conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use, the official system, and point out serious flaws which was necessary before alternative better systems can be put into place, help organize this participatory system of both monitoring and management. In particular, I am very happy at these locality specific efficient community based forest management systems. And I did not talk about it, but there have been a whole range of issues also about environmental impact assessments which are prepared. And again, I have been quite active in trying to open up and get better, more transparent participatory environmental impact assessments of various development projects prepared. So, I believe I have been able to put my understanding of ecology and generally what science means, what methodology of science is, what science should be used for, to maybe to a very limited extent, no doubt, put science in the service of symbiotic relationships in the Indian society. Thank you very much.